Well, on a day when Donald Trump claims to have reached a deal to end his war in Iran that is a complete failure of his original objective of Iran's, quote, unconditional surrender, the Trump White House has been rocked by stunning new reporting in the New York Times that some in the White House seem to consider so accurate that they are accusing New York Times reporters of having obtained audio recordings of White House Situation Room meetings. Think about that. The White House is not condemning this new devastating reporting from inside the Trump White House as a pack of lies. Instead, they are, in effect, declaring it to be so shockingly 100% accurate that the reporters must have audio recordings of what was said in the White House. Axios is reporting top White House officials believe New York Times reporters Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan obtained audio recordings of Situation Room meetings for their forthcoming book, Regime Change. No White House has ever made that accusation about a book sourced from inside that White House. And every presidential administration since Richard Nixon has had such books written, most of them by Bob Woodward. And there are always some people who try to cast doubt on some of the accuracy in those books. But the truth of it is that most of those books, especially the Woodward books, have been highly accurate, with White House meetings recreated through interviews of participants in those meetings. The White House is saying, think about this, that Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan have gone so far beyond any other inside the White House book, especially any other inside the Trump White House book, and reached a level of what they think is such perfect accuracy that it's achievable only by reporters obtaining audio recordings. Axios reported, quote, such a taped leak would be a shocking breach of one of the most secure settings on Earth. Independent recording devices in the Situation Room are forbidden. So that means White House sources suspect someone in Donald Trump's White House working for Donald Trump was improperly recording Situation Room meetings and then handing them over to the New York Times. Axios reports, we're afraid some of our most sensitive conversations were being recorded, an administration source told us. That is the highest possible compliment that any White House has ever issued about any book written to expose the inner workings of that White House. It must all be on audio tape. The book, titled Regime Change, will go on sale a week from now and can be pre-ordered online and ordered at your local bookstore, and you can get your name on a list for it at your local public library. And the White House is now promising you that this book is worth it. Much of what you will be reading has apparently been certified accurate by the Trump White House. Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan have shared some of the reporting in their book in 2 breaking news articles for the New York Times. In today's edition, a report on the debate within the Trump White House led by Stephen Miller to suspend a constitutional right. Something so insane that even people in the Trump White House used the word insane to describe it. And now think about that one. How insane does something have to be for people working in the Trump White House to think that it is insane? They work for a man who says insane things every day that they accept and publicly support whenever called upon to do so. But privately, they thought Stephen Miller's idea was insane. That's their word for it. Today's New York Times reports some figures in the White House privately called suspending habeas corpus insane. The legal doctrine of habeas corpus has its origins in the oldest English common law and actually predates the Magna Carta of 1215. It took written form in England in the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679 during the reign of King Charles II. It prevents the government from arbitrarily imprisoning people without giving them a right to a hearing. It was something that, as Stephen Miller put it, we're actively looking at.
The Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So I would say that's an option we're actively looking at.
The White House Staff Secretary, William Scharf, wrote a memo arguing against Stephen Miller's idea of suspending habeas corpus. The Times reports the memo this way. The history of habeas corpus dates back to the very dawn of English common law. He recorded in his memo to Susie Wiles, denial of habeas corpus rights was a key grievance underlying the American Revolution. And the right to apply to the federal courts for habeas corpus review dates to the beginning of the Republic. Stephen Miller wanted to suspend habeas corpus for immigrants in order to speed up what Donald Trump had promised would be the mass deportation of immigrants. Stephen Miller argued that the presence of undocumented immigrants in the country, even those who had been here for decades working harder at their jobs than Stephen Miller ever has, constituted an invasion, and therefore habeas corpus could be suspended. The Times reports habeas corpus had been formally suspended only 4 times, most recently after Pearl Harbor. In every case, the country was at war or facing armed rebellion. Only Lincoln, at the start of the Civil War, had ever claimed the power without congressional authorization, and only during a long congressional recess. Because habeas corpus was written into the body of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton argued in Federalist Paper 84 that a Bill of Rights was therefore unnecessary. Hamilton said that the habeas corpus provision of the Constitution was enough to prevent the worst possible kind of tyranny. Alexander Hamilton wrote, "The practice of arbitrary imprisonments have been in all ages the favorite and most formidable instruments of tyranny." And so it's Alexander Hamilton versus Stephen Miller in the Trump White House. And as of tonight, Alexander Hamilton is winning. But Stephen Miller has a huge advantage over Alexander Hamilton because Stephen Miller is still working in the Trump White House with a president and a vice president who could not be more ignorant of our history. James David Vance proved that with this statement.
If you go back to World War II, if you go back to World War I, if you go back to every major conflict in human history, they all end with some kind of negotiation.
No, they didn't. World War II ended with 0 negotiations. World War II ended the way Donald Trump claimed his war in Iran was going to end: unconditional surrender. Japan and Germany each signed unconditional surrender documents. Adolf Hitler killed himself rather than submit Germany to the unconditional surrender that he knew was coming. Every vice president, everyone prior to J.D. Vance has known that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt demanded the unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan during World War II. And when FDR died in the final months of the war, his vice president, then elevated to the presidency, Harry Truman, accepted those unconditional surrenders without a word of negotiation with anyone about those surrenders. That kind of statement by J.D. Vance, demonstrating a complete ignorance of how World War II ended, is the kind of thing that used to get you drummed out of American politics before Donald Trump's dumbing down of the Republican Party. And it tells you something about the quality of thinking that the Vice President of the United States brings to his job. In the report by Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan in today's New York Times, J.D. Vance began a White House meeting last year by arguing that it was time to invoke the Insurrection Act, which allows the president to deploy the American military to put down insurrections and rebellions inside the United States. He did this after Renee Good and Alex Preddy were shot and killed by Donald Trump's federal agents in Minnesota when video recordings of the incidents showed that they did not pose any threats at all to the agents who shot and killed them. The Times reports Mr. Vance got to the point they needed to invoke the Insurrection Act swiftly to crush the unrest in Minnesota. It would be painful in the short term, he said, but the message it would send that paid agitators could not get away with disrupting ICE operations would make sure no one tried it again. There was no evidence that either Mr. Preddy or Ms. Good had been paid activists. Once again, it fell to William Scharf to make the point that the Insurrection Act, as the Times reports, simply did not fit the circumstances on the ground. And so, yes, it is easy to imagine what goes on in the Trump White House, as easy as we always thought it was. Discussions of trampling the Constitution, violating the law, and crushing our rights. Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan report that the discussion that day of invoking the Insurrection Act to send American troops into the streets of Minneapolis and who knows where else in this country was inconclusive. The meeting broke up without a decision, a vague consensus to keep thinking about it, but it had been clarifying in its own way, even after the administration's posture had helped escalate tensions in Minnesota. Even with the blowback mounting, the vice president and Mr. Miller were still searching for a reason to put federal troops on American streets, just as the idea of suspending habeas corpus was set aside but never fully abandoned by some inside the White House. The Insurrection Act, at least in the eyes of its proponents, would remain a loaded weapon in a West Wing eager to test the limits of presidential power. The Insurrection Act remains a loaded weapon that some observers have suggested could be aimed at our polling places in swing states like Georgia that could go either way in the November election. Leading off our discussion tonight is Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia. He serves on the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate Banking Committee. He's also the author of the new book, The Crooked Places Made Straight, Reflections on the Moral Meaning of America. Senator, thank you very much for joining us tonight. In the previous hour, Rachel was reporting on a task force assembled by Chuck Schumer that includes you, includes others outside the Senate, Mark Elias, who appeared with Rachel, talking about these very issues of what is the worst case scenario facing us on Election Day. What do we have to be prepared for? And it comes on a day when we read Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan's report of the discussions of the Insurrection Act in the White House that sure looks like the kind of loaded weapon that could be aimed at our elections.
No, absolutely, and great to be with you. This president has demonstrated time and time again, and his vice president, as we hear in these words, that they are willing to do anything to stay in power. And I think that we shouldn't be surprised by that. We've seen plenty of evidence. What has been striking is the extent to which colleagues of mine in the Congress are willing to go along on this ride. And so we are remaining vigilant. We have to be prepared for this moment. We have to take it very seriously. But here's what we cannot afford to do. We cannot give in to those who are trying to weaponize despair. They've been trying to flood the zone, throw everything at us. And now we're seeing some of the things that they're thinking about throwing at us. And part of the work that they're trying to do is to convince the citizenry that there's no need to push back. And what we learned by watching the wonderful folks of Minnesota is that standing up and resisting does make a difference. I was just inspired by the people of Minneapolis. I had to go and stand there. It was freezing cold. You know, I'm from Georgia, way below zero. But night after night after night, those folks were standing there and looking out for their neighbors. And clearly that got J.D. Vance's attention. He is, in my estimation, one of the most craven politicians on the American landscape. And it's deeply concerning to see this reporting. We've got to remain prepared. We know something about the government overreaching in Fulton County. Remember, they sent the FBI in to snatch ballots from the 2020 election. They are harassing election workers with subpoenas, demanding information from people who are just volunteers. And so we remain focused on this. But part of what we need people to do is prepare to show up. show up, show up, show up. And we'll be using every tool that we have to try to keep our democracy intact.
With all of the gaming out of worst case scenarios, including Donald Trump using the Insurrection Act at J.D. Vance's urgings to send federal troops to your polling places in Georgia, because you know they're sending them to Georgia, right? They're not sending them to Massachusetts. They're going to send them to the place, the swing state where it can make a difference, where they think they might be able to keep Jon Ossoff out of the Senate, things like that, but places like that around the country. Is voter turnout, is it possible for voter turnout to be so big, even in the face of American troops, that the voter turnout could be the ultimate weapon to overwhelm these kinds of tactics?
Well, we got to use all our tools. The answer to this attack on democracy is more democracy. Mm-hmm. We've got to use the tools of our democratic experiment. And we saw that in Minnesota with them standing up, protesting night after night, looking out for their neighbors. And yes, people need to show up in Georgia. What I know from experience, from somebody who's run a couple of races in that purple state, is that, voter suppression is not really about, you don't have to take millions of votes. You just make it difficult for people to show up. You undermine people's access a little bit here, a little bit there, shave around the edges, even before you get to something like troops on the street. And that can swing an election. They said that in the first weekend of the runoff election, in my second election, that people couldn't vote that weekend. And they misinterpreted this old law in Georgia, a couple days after the holiday, and you couldn't show up. So they said their hands were tied. It was the law, is what officials in Georgia said. And since they said their hands were tied, I decided to untie their hands. I sued them. And we won the suit. And then the folks who said their hands were tied, showed their hands, appealed the suit. They could have gotten us ready to vote. They appealed the suit. 2 appeals before Georgia voters could show up that first weekend of the runoff. About 70,000 or so people voted that weekend. I won by about 100,000 votes. So these things are close. And they can go a little bit here, a little bit there, which is why we have to remain vigilant on every front. We have to use the courts. We need an army of lawyers. We need to continue to raise questions around ICE. If they put ICE in front of polls, that's illegal. It's unconstitutional. They can't do it. That doesn't seem to bother this administration that much. And yes, showing up makes it harder to steal an election. As we're watching this gerrymandering that's going on all across the South as a result of this awful decision made by the partisans on the Supreme Court. They're using every tool. And so we've got to show up and overwhelm their projections about who's going to show up.
We're going to squeeze in a commercial break here. When we come back, I want to ask you about public attack on the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, at the White House of all places this weekend. This is Trump filth. I don't normally want to traffic in these things, but I think this is a night when we need Reverend Warnock to guide us through a reaction to this. We're going to be right back. Senator Raphael Warnock is the pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church of Atlanta, the same church where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. served as pastor, as his father did before him. Raphael Warnock's new book is titled The Crooked Places Made Straight: Reflections on the Moral Meaning of America. And this one's for Reverend Warnock, because this is something I think we need literally spiritual guidance on how to bear this kind of thing. I want to ask you about what happened at the White House this weekend. One of the fighters and performing there, I've never heard of the guy, specifically attacked Michelle Obama viciously, poisonously, by name, in a way that everyone there seemed to enjoy. No objection from Donald Trump. He called the guy outstanding afterwards, as he did all the other performers up there. What do you feel when you hear something like that?
Michelle Obama is one of the most dignified people one could ever meet. She served brilliantly as First Lady of the United States of America. She's a graduate of Princeton and Harvard. It doesn't matter to folks like that. This idea that black women aren't really women and black people aren't really people harkens to the darkest days in our country's history. This is not political speech. This is immoral speech. This is bigotry. This is evil come alive in words, because words have power. And if you can diminish people, if you can say that there's something other, then that opens the door for you to unleash the kind of cruelty that we're seeing under the Trump administration. So it was very painful to hear the reporting about this. You know, I've had the pleasure of being in the presence of the First Lady, but when I see this, I don't just think about her, I think about my own sister. Mm-hmm. I think about my mother. I think about the teachers. I think about the women in my church, you know, who have loved this country through its darkest moments, who've always held on to hope. And here we are. Once again, Donald Trump has unleashed a kind of evil in the ether of the American experience. And this is a moral moment in America. And it's time for people to stand up. We know who he is. If that performer, I don't know him either. He's not worth knowing. He felt the license to do that. Mm-hmm. And there are other folks sitting there. Donald Trump is sitting there, the president of the United States. He didn't condemn it. Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who I hear will be out tomorrow talking about his conversion experience as a Catholic, mm-hmm. talking about his moral bearing. I want to know what J.D. Vance thinks about the First Lady of the United States being treated in this way and spoken about in such awful terms. He is married himself to a woman of color. How would he feel if someone said this to his wife or said this about his wife? We have to condemn hate and bigotry wherever it shows up. And that's something that I always try to be very, very vigilant about. Hate, however it shows up. You have to condemn it, you have to push back, and you have to remind us that we're stronger when we're able to look into the eyes of our neighbor, even those with whom we disagree, and see that all of us have within ourselves a spark of the divine, see a glimpse of our own humanity, and push us toward the highest in the American creed, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. This administration is at war with the American creed. This brilliant idea that we come from different places and spaces, we are different, and we're held together not by race. We're held together not even by religion, and I'm a deep man of faith and commitment to that. We're held together by an idea that all of us are children of God and that we have a right to be here and make America as great as it can be.
So it's so true that the subtitle of your book, Reflections on the Moral Meaning of America, you know you have a president who has never once reflected on that.
I don't, yeah, that's to put it nicely. I mean, he's at war with it.
At war with it.
And so it's a dark moment in our country as we approach this 250th anniversary. You know, the United States of America goes through its moments. There are moments when the democracy expands, there are moments when it contracts. And this is a contraction moment. They're trying to squeeze the voices of voters out of their democracy, black voters through this awful gerrymandering that the court has approved. They're trying to squeeze the voices of women as they're still trying to pass the SAVE Act, which would disproportionately hurt married women. And we've got to push back because here is what every mother knows, that contractions are painful, but they are necessary for new birth. And so I'm still holding on to hope. I still believe in America at its best. And I think that through this contraction moment, there is the opportunity to reimagine, to push us closer towards our ideals, which is why I wrote this sermon for the whole country.
It's I'm going to use the title as it appears, your title as it appears on the bio on the jacket of the book, Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock. Thank you very much for this book, The Crooked Places Made Straight. I want to get it on camera here. There it is. Reflections on the moral meaning of America. It is a sermon, and it is the kind of thing I was so glad to be holding this in my hand this weekend, both before and after I heard that poison from the White House. This does help. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Bless you. Keep the faith.
Thank you. And coming up, Richard Nixon said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam, but that was before he was president. Donald Trump now has a secret deal, he says, to end the war in Iran. And that deal, if it exists, is apparently so humiliating to Donald Trump that he's keeping it secret. Lieutenant General Mark Hertling will join us next. Yesterday, Donald Trump posted on social media that a deal with Iran, quote, is now complete. That was his word, complete. He also claimed that the Strait of Hormuz would be open to free flow of shipping on Friday. But whatever this so-called deal looks like, it is bad enough for the United States that Donald Trump doesn't want anyone to see it. Unlike President Obama's written deal to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, every word of which was released publicly. On Saturday, President Obama said this.
It is doubtful that any agreement that arises is going to be significantly different or a significant improvement from the deal that we had in the first place and had worked for a long stretch of time before the United States pulled out of it.
And now Donald Trump's vice president is trying to defend the kind of thing that Donald Trump used to say was indefensible.
The Iranians are saying that they're going to have access to a $300 billion reconstruction fund. True or false?
Well, Ed, that's the sort of thing they could have access to, funded by the Gulf Coast Coalition, so long as they honor their end of the obligation.
Joining us now is Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, retired commander of U.S. Army in Europe. He is an MS Now military analyst. General, it's hard to talk about something we haven't seen, this so-called deal, but we're getting reports tonight like Donald Trump saying the Strait of Hormuz will be absolutely toll-free. New York Times headline says maybe they're not going to be called tolls, but Iran will be charging fees to pass through the strait at some point. What's your assessment of this war and this outcome?
In trying to deal with facts, Lawrence, what I see is we have the administration claiming some things, the Iranian administration and the Iranian-backed media claiming others, in some cases saying that what the U.S. administration is saying is not true. And then you have independent reporters who are trying to get the facts, and they can't seem to find them. When you see various members of the U.S. administration, Mr. Trump's cabinet members and vice president go out and speaking, they seem to be obfuscating everything that is part of what the president says is a deal. I think he wanted to go to the G7 conference and declare himself a victor and proclaim great accomplishments and maybe even ending another war, the ninth war of which he started himself. But I guarantee you that those members of the G7 are not buying it, just like Senator Thune is not buying it because he hasn't seen the memorandum of understanding and he doesn't even know what's in it. So you have an administration that's speculating on what they think they would like to happen. But unfortunately, whenever you're talking about negotiations with foreign countries, especially after conflict, you have to have both sides on the same page. And it's readily apparent to any independent observer, we are not on the same side or on the same page as Iran is right now.
And within the context of what the Trump administration is trying to achieve here and how they think it's going to be achieved, were you as shocked as I was when you heard the vice president say that World War II ended in a negotiation like what Donald Trump has been doing for the last 100 days?
I was not shocked. I was just befuddled that he would say something like that. But this is not the first time we've heard members of the administration say things like that. It's a total disregard of history. It's a lack of understanding of other cultures or what has happened in the long timeline of the United States conducting operations in foreign countries. I was once told, if you want a new idea, read an old book. None of these individuals have read an old book. It would be nice to know that when you're dealing with other nations in these kind of negotiations, that you understand the cultural dynamics and the historical dynamics of the country you're dealing with, or even United States history. And it seems that sometimes they forget that.
Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Pleasure, Lawrence. Thank you.
And coming up, after the New York Times last week reported on what they call the Epstein files freakout at the White House, our next guest, Congressman Robert Garcia, asked for the testimony of all of the participants in the White House Epstein files freakout, including Vice President J.D. Vance. Congressman Robert Garcia joins us next. After Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan reported on the, quote, White House freakout over the Epstein files in an excerpt from their new book, Regime Change, our next guest, Congressman Robert Garcia, the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, issued a request for testimony from several Trump officials listed in that article about the freakout, including Vice President J.D. Vance, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, and FBI Director Kashyap Patel. And today, award-winning journalist Julie K. Brown, whose work helped lead to the 2019 arrest of Jeffrey Epstein and 2020 arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell, reports in the Miami Herald. Sarah Kellen, a longtime personal assistant to sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, has disclosed for the first time that Epstein's preferential treatment at the Palm Beach County Jail may have been the result of him paying off Palm Beach Sheriff's deputies. Kellen, during her interview with the House Oversight Committee last month, was questioned about perks that Epstein received while he was incarcerated at the Palm Beach County Stockade, a facility where Epstein was jailed from 2008 to 2009. She said she visited Epstein several times at the jail, and one time when she was home, she was able to use Skype from a jail computer. He was able to use Skype from a jail computer to contact her. He used that computer to get her to undress for him on camera while he was in the jail, Kellen testified. She was then asked by Florida Congressman Maxwell Frost, a Democrat who represents the Orlando area, whether she knew of any other ways that Epstein was able to receive special treatment in the jail. I know that he arranged to have cash and, like Disneyland tickets, taken to one of the officers in the jail, and I'm not sure what he received with that, Kellen replied. According to a transcript of her testimony, she identified that Palm Beach's sheriff's deputy she identified the Palm Beach Sheriff's deputy as Michael Fox. She was asked how she learned about Fox, and she explained that Epstein's paralegal, Story Culls, had complained to her that he had to drive a long distance to personally deliver the cash and tickets from Epstein. The Miami Herald was unsuccessful in reaching Michael Fox. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Robert Garcia of California. He's the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us tonight. You apparently read Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan's reporting about the White House freakout at the same time we all did. And you would now like to hear testimony from the participants in that very comprehensively described freakout.
Absolutely. I mean, quite frankly, it was a bombshell report. And obviously, we're beginning to learn even more about the activities around the White House. And there's more to be expected as the book comes out and more information comes out about the White House and what's going on on the inside of this administration, the most corrupt in history. Look, the reality is, for the very first time in this entire investigation, we have learned that the vice president, J.D. Vance, has also been at the center of this cover-up, directing strategy, holding who knows how many meetings in the Situation Room, a place reserved for national emergencies, and bringing together the top administration officials to talk strategy to exonerate President Trump from the Epstein files. We still don't know, and it's unclear how many meetings they were. What were the full conversations about? What else did J.D. Vance direct? And certainly, the notion that he was suggesting that Tucker Carlson should interview Ghislaine Maxwell, or that somehow they're discussing this pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell. This is high-level conspiracy. It's high-level cover-up. It's information that we need to get out. And so my request to Comer, the chairman, has been simple. We need to talk to these top admin officials and get them in front of our committee.
The idea of having Tucker Carlson interview her publicly in a way that they hoped would be favorable to Donald Trump, certainly from J.D. Vance's perspective, had the advantage of, well, that's not going to be under oath in any way.
That's exactly right. Look, I think people need to really understand why this has been so important. Is we do now know that the vice president is part of the cover-up, and he must answer questions. He is suggesting, essentially, and trying to figure out ways to exonerate Donald Trump, to clear Donald Trump's name. He's making those suggestions. Well, what other suggestions did he make? What other conversations was he having in the Situation Room with Susie Wiles, with the FBI director, with the head of the DOJ? These are the top officials at the Justice Department and throughout the administration, with the Communications Department. So J.D. Vance is now at the center of this cover-up, and he's got to answer questions. The simple fact that they were discussing Ghislaine Maxwell as a possible pardon and as a way of actually getting Trump and the heat off of Trump is horrific. And it's crazy. It's crazy that they thought they're going to get away with this.
Yeah, there was a lot of public speculation that they were talking about or thinking about pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell. Donald Trump certainly wouldn't rule it out when he was asked about it from reporters. And now you have these documented account from inside the White House, thanks to Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, that yes, indeed, they were talking about pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell.
I think that's right. And I think what's really interesting is, we only know what's been released so far. And so I expect there's going to be a lot more ahead, including more information about our investigation and what they're talking about in the White House. We just learned recently from Pam Bondi, when she was in front of us, that she put all the blame on Todd Blanche and that she admitted that she had no idea about the Ghislaine Maxwell transfer. She learned about it in the media after the fact. I mean, give me a break. And she could not remember how it happened, who got asked, who actually made the request. So Todd Blanche also has a lot to answer for here. We have no information. This reporting tells us and gives us an insight that the Ghislaine Maxwell pardon, the interview, reaching out to her, was all essentially devised in the Situation Room, a place reserved, as we know, for national security, for national emergencies. And apparently, the Epstein investigation is so serious that that's where they're having these meetings.
Yeah, Todd Blanche was basically volunteering to play the Tucker Carlson role suggested by J.D. Vance.
That's exactly right. I mean, essentially, Todd Blanche became the Tucker Carlson stand-in. And we know that Ghislaine Maxwell then gets moved to a less secure prison. No one will tell us why or who directed the move. Still to this day, no one will tell us why. We've got to get that question answered. And it's clear that Todd Blanche is working through this meeting in the Situation Room to exonerate and to essentially get the heat off the president. Well, the heat's not coming off the president. We're only going to intensify it. He has questions that we need to get answers to all these questions, including from the VP.
Congressman Robert Garcia, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Tonight's Last Word is next.